On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Index plunged more than 500 points Monday, its worst single-day drop since September 2001. Investment firm nearly $4 billion in the last quarter.
Bankruptcy of investment bank Lehman Brothers.
That set the stage for the U.S. housing bust most often blamed for the current economic meltdown.
Prices fell like dominoes. In Japan, the Nikkei index fell to a 5.5-year low, down 10% after electronics giant Sony cut its profit forecast in half. In South Korea,
we have acted boldly to help prevent the crisis on Wall Street from becoming a crisis in communities across our country.
This looks like people just got up and left this house.
American to start buying again and stimulate the economy.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of The World Today. We have in the studio with us to discuss 10 years after the crisis and the Wall Street crash, two people who in their different ways have been writing about the developments in the world economy. One, and Pettifor, is of course extremely well known as one of the foremost campaigners against the debt imposed by the international financial institutions on countries rich and poor in Europe and in Africa for many, many years, and is, of course, the author of a number of books, the latest of which, The Production of Money, came out last year. And we have in the studio Grace Blakeley, from a much younger generation, but we're very happy to have you with us, Grace, who has written a number of very fine essays on the alternatives available, which are not being taken up to the austerity measures, and in particular, we hope, all three of us, by a Corbyn government before too long. And if I could come to you first, 2008, huge crash, unpredicted by most, shock horror, banks bailed out with trillions and trillions of funds globally, austerity against people who are less well off, not just the poor or the very poor, but even against middle-class people all over the world. And these austerity measures presented as something without which we cannot do by politicians from all sides. When you took up the debt campaign in a big way, of course that predates the crash by many years, did you ever think that there could be a crash on this scale and that the political and economic elites would sit back and do nothing?
Yes, well, it just so happens that the campaign came to a head in 2001, completed in 2001, and I had 3 years at the New Economics Foundation, and I was studying and looking at the poorest countries in Latin America, in Africa, and in parts of Asia. And I sort of looked up at the Anglo-American economies and realized that the debt crisis in the Anglo-American economies was far more serious. And in fact, in 2006, I published a book called The Coming, not against my will, the title was The Coming First World Debt Crisis. The publisher had said she had the rights over the title. I didn't like First World, Third World. And I said to her, you know, it's going to be published in September 2006, and it's called The Coming First World Debt Crisis, but it will have come by 2006, you know. And then my book will be out of date, I said. How wrong I was, and how good for me she was, because, of course, that meant that I was one of the few to predict it. And it was possible to do because by looking at what was happening to the sovereign debts of the poorest countries, and then comparing that, I mean, we wanted about $350 billion of debt written off for 30 of the poorest countries. But actually, Anglo-American debt was in the trillions relative to income, relative to GDP. And that we knew that it just was common sense that that's not going to be sustainable. The really frightening thing, Tariq, is that then it was about 269% of GDP, the share of debt relative to real income. Today it's in 320% of GDP versus income. So the debt bubble in the Anglo-American economies today is even bigger than it was before 2007-8, you know. So yes, I did see it coming, but unfortunately my book felt like a lead balloon, and all the mainstream economists said, well, you can't trust her, she's just a left-winger and that's wishful thinking on her part. And so it never went anywhere, but fortunately afterwards people recognized it.
Grace, what got you interested in economics, first of all? Tell us that.
It's actually interesting because a lot of people that focus on debt and the financial system come to economics from the perspective of a kind of focus on international economics or, having studied the Global South. I personally was interested in, I studied extensively conflict in Africa. So I was in the Congo, for example, for a while at university. And what interested me in what I study now, which is financialization, is the kind of the extractive flows that govern the global economy, the global financial system, which sustain the standard of living that the global north is able to achieve today. And what I think is interesting about what Anne was saying and what I've laid out in a recent report I've just written is the way in which the kind of first world, in inverted commas, debt crisis is sustained by exorbitant amounts of extraction from the global south. The classic prediction of macroeconomics is that capital flows out, the currencies depreciate, that then makes them more competitive and they're able to increase their exports. Instead, what happened was, because that capital was flowing out of the UK and the US, wasn't flowing into places like China because of capital controls, or Germany because of the euro, and therefore wasn't allowing these things to rebalance. All that capital ended up flowing back into the UK and the US, and particularly into deposits in UK banks, which were used to back up loans that were made to consumers, particularly mortgage loans. So, as Anne lays out in her book, banks create money by issuing debt, but to a certain extent they have to back that up by a certain amount of deposits, which is determined by regulation. And inflows from the global south allowed that lending to go on for far longer than it otherwise might have. So by analysing those kind of flows that undergird the global financial system, where they come from, where they go, I think you get quite a profound insight into the makings of modern capitalism.
Well, we'll come back to this question later when we discuss alternatives, but just one other thing. And at the time of the crash, a great deal was written that if we don't bail all the banks out, everything's going to collapse.
Yeah.
So people were fearful, they got talked in,
Yes.
the media was solidly behind the banks.
Yeah.
What would have happened if they'd kept some banks going, paid off the small depositors, possibly, and allowed quite a few of these banks to go under?
There was a moment immediately after the collapse of Lehman's, Saturday afternoon, one weekend, when the central bank governors and the finance ministers sitting around tables understood that on Monday morning, ATM machines, holes in the wall, if you like, were not going to open, and people would not be able to get their money out of the bank because the banks were basically all bust. Now, that would have caused economic and social and political upheaval. If people could not access their own money, there would have been madness on the streets. So I defend the actual bailout of the system. We need to think about the monetary system a bit like the sanitation system. It is actually fundamental to the economy, and you can't allow the sanitation system just to be closed down. Equally, you can't allow the monetary system to be closed down. However, having said that, the bailout should have had terms and conditions. And the big weakness is that they were just bailed out. They weren't told, we will bail you out, but thou shalt invest in the real economy, thou shalt lend at very low rates of interest to SMEs and to businesses and to the government. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not pay bonuses to your staff, and thou shalt not pay dividends to your shareholders so long as taxpayers have bailed you out. And the extraordinary thing was that both our finance ministers and our central bankers, to be honest, didn't really understand the nature of the monetary system. There was a great deal of ignorance, and I blame the economics profession for that, because in economics, when you're studying macroeconomics, you do very little work on money, debt and banks. Very convenient for the financial system that most people educated in economics don't understand the nature of money, the nature of banks, the nature of debt. And so when the crisis hit, politicians like Alistair Darling here in Britain and in America were stunned. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't understand the crisis. They didn't understand why, mainly because economists didn't understand why. So as a result, these banks were bailed out. If you like, they were just allowed to take all the money and run. And I know there was, I remember a moment after Lehman's when the banks were sort of humble and you could see, you could hear, they even spoke about, you know, oh dear, what are going to be the
They were prepared for punishment.
They were prepared for punishment. And to their astonishment, there was none.
Well, no, some of the Wall Street bankers said they were called into the Obama White House. They thought they were going to be rapped on the knuckles really hard and told, from now on, you can't do A, B, C, D.
Yes.
They were prepared for that.
Yes, and they didn't.
He didn't, and nor did the Europeans.
And I think the 10 years since means that there's much greater understanding now of the way the international financial system operates. And that empowers people. But on the day after Lehman's, people were mainly stunned and shocked. And that allowed the banks to get away with what they got away with.
Grace, we are now 10 years on. Most of the parties in power in Europe, including these far-right parties in Italy and Austria, who've come to power promising all sorts of, you know, reforms, rebuilding, and are basically going to be neoliberal. They have really no plan for change. And the only, I mean, I don't say this because we're all British and live in Britain. It just happens to be a fact that the only serious alternative so far anywhere in Europe has come from Corbyn and McDonnell. For the first time ever, the Labour left has captured the leadership and are promising a whole set of reforms, economic and others. So what do you think the possibilities are? Let's say a Corbyn government is elected, and let's say John McDonnell calls you in, which I hope he will, and Anne and others, and says, okay, gang, what are we going to do? What are our first measures?
So I will answer that question specifically in a second, but I think prior to doing that, it's necessary to look a little bit about the political economic context in which that is going to be taking place, because all of what Anne was talking about in the answer to the previous question has to do with, as well as economic ignorance, the transformation in the nature of political economy under late capitalism, under the capitalism we've been living under since the 1980s. And essentially the financialization of the state, of corporations, of all those different sorts of things. Of everyday life, exactly. The kind of insane amounts of power that financial markets wield is and should be a kind of perennial thought in the back of the mind of any left government, and is, but for a very different reason, a perennial thought in the back of the mind of any neoliberal government, because that is a system that they have worked to create. They've worked to hem themselves in to ensure that political economy, that institutions require that they are only able to implement policies that benefit financial capital. So I think it's worth beginning at that point and saying that, you know, we're not going to be going into government saying, with a big red button that says socialism. We're going to have to work for an extended period of time to transform that political economy, to effectively bring international finance under democratic oversight and control. And for me, the first and most important thing there, and I think you've talked about this a lot, is just a write-off of unsecured consumer debt. And that can be done in a number of different ways.
Mainly credit card debt.
So not secured is kind of against collateral. Unsecured is without any asset to back it up. So credit card debt, which is a really extractive and exploitative form of lending for a lot of people. And so I would say write that off. And that can come in a number of different ways. If you want to be very nice to the banks, you get the state to kind of print money and buy it. Or if, alternatively, you can force them to take a haircut on that and say, we're not going to enforce people to repay back a portion of these debts. Probably going to look like a mixture of the two. But that would have a number of different impacts. Firstly, it would dramatically improve a lot of people's lives, moving away from a situation of constant subjective feeling of precarity and fear, towards a situation in which one can imagine one's future. So, that would give a massive boost to consumption, and hopefully would be able to direct that towards a more kind of sustainable consumption rather than debt-fueled consumption that we've seen over the last several decades. And finally, it would have a dramatic impact on the finance sector, which relies on the extraction of rents from the productive economy in order to maintain the huge profits that is maintained for the last several decades.
But Anne, historically in Britain and British capitalism in particular, which is what we're discussing now, there's always been a bias in favor of the financial sector. The industrial sector has always held second place, apart from the very first years of the Industrial Revolution. And this has now gone on and on and on till it's reached a stage where the whole thing has become completely absurd. So some new form has to be discovered. And one of the things being talked about in the Corbyn and McDonnell offices and with their economic advisors is a public utilities-based system, where you strengthen the public utilities. And linked to that, of course, is this, that people don't even realize this, that large amounts of investments and hedge funds, etc., are invested in by pension fund holders. And who are the people who pay these pensions? Ordinary workers. And trade unions, labor councils, elected people, who, once they've given the money for investment, have no control over it at all. So together with the public utilities, this assertion of democratic rights over the system becomes very important. And they have to do something like that. And of course, Grace is right, it can't happen immediately. You have to build up to that, but say to people, this is what we are doing, patience.
I've got lots of ambition for the next Labour government. But I think the thing that the public have to understand, and this is the public everywhere actually, is that the financial system is parasitic on the public system, basically. That without taxpayers, it's funny, without taxpayers, they would really not exist. Now, I know that in Britain we have a taxpayers alliance, but actually it's only for the rich who don't want to pay taxes. I want us to have a people's taxpayers alliance, which will say, first of all, the really interesting thing is that we've privatized pensions here. And the currency, sterling's value, is largely determined by the fact that there are 30.3 million British taxpayers who, unlike Apple and Amazon and so on, regularly pay their taxes. That gives value to the currency. And these guys gamble with the currency. You know, so you could say, sorry, but if you want to use our currency, these are the terms and conditions. But we, the people, don't understand that we have that leverage over the financial system. We don't understand how closely integrated it is with these public resources, which are our resources. But somehow or other, I want a Labour government to be more confident of the power that we actually have. Without these public resources, these financial institutions would be kaput. But also, if the public understood that we have leverage and power, then that would bolster the changes that a Labour government makes.
Grace, this should be part of the campaigning now. That this is, you know, to explain in a fairly straightforward way what Anne has been saying, that it's no big dogma, it's to get the economy back on its feet and to improve the status of the productive economy.
Absolutely, and what we've really been lacking, I think, in our political, we've been starting from such a low base. We've been kind of overwhelmed by the liberal centrism that presumes not only kind of no real oppositionality, that economics is like a positive sum game and that everyone benefits from economic growth, but also from this kind of false division between politics and economics. The idea that there's an economic sphere and that needs to be run by technocrats, and there's a political sphere which governs the distribution of those economic things, and that needs to be governed by politics. So I think this is one of the reasons why talking about financialization is so important, not just because it is a central factor in our economy, but also because doing so allows us to understand and conceptualize and organize our thinking according to a fundamental opposition that allows people to mobilize and makes them feel like they have control and the capacity to change things. But also undermining this idea that the economy is over here, it's separate, it's the role of experts to deal to,
That's
make
experts
decisions.
is the key. to break
Exactly.
this. It's,
Yeah.
it's like voodoo.
Yeah.
And they talk a strange language
Yeah,
which none of us is meant to understand.
And you're, no, exactly, you're not meant to understand.
And none of it, Tariq, is rocket science, I can assure you.
Yeah.
We all effectively do understand the economy because we all engage in the economy. We borrow, we know what the rate of interest is, we know about the value of the currency, we know about exchange rates if we travel. This is basically, you know, all you really need to know to understand the key forces in the economy.
The other thing that people do understand, I think now very clearly, is that for the last decades, the rich have been getting richer, to put it at its crudest, and the poorer, poorer.
Yeah.
And the levels of social inequality and wage inequalities in the so-called advanced economies of the West have reached a crazy level, unheard of before.
Yes.
When you think even about the Gilded Age, it really wasn't as bad as this. And that people understand.
Yes.
But often when you speak to people, they say, but what can we do about it?
Exactly.
And this is where politicians are failing.
Yes.
And the centrists, the extreme center groups, I call them, are collapsing all over.
Yes.
And then demagogues like Trump or Salvini come and say, we will sort it out. I mean, Trump says, we're going to clear the swamp, Wall Street.
Yes. Yeah. And then
2
he hires
weeks after being president, the swamp is in the White House.
Yes.
You know, I mean, so
Yes.
these guys won't, you know, they will not last. But there has to be an alternative.
I think people are so disillusioned that they're looking to strong men and women to protect them from market forces, from free market forces out of control, basically. But absolutely, you know, and the thing is this, that it's very interesting to see that, for example, the Financial Times and The Economist are beginning to fret about the levels
They're
of
nervous.
inequality.
Yeah, and I think you've got to look at the creation of that massive bureaucracy, as well as the supporting apparatus of kind of business services that's proliferated over the last 30 years, as part of a wider mechanism to create a constituency of people that benefit from the extractive model that you were talking about. The kind of creation of this like mini capitalist class. So you've got kind of deliberate mass extension of home ownership, the privatisation of pension funds. But not only that, that combined with a bargain, which is essentially that these things will constantly continue to rise in value. And there are a set of contradictions that exist at the heart of that. Together, they entail a contradiction because if everything keeps on rising in price, you're shutting more and more people out of the market, as we're seeing in housing. But even, you know, in and of themselves, they contain a contradiction, which is what Minsky talked about, which is continually rising asset prices will always end in a huge crash. And 2007 was the crisis of pension fund capitalism, property-owning democracy, and that bargain between the 1% and the middle classes. And we've tried to resurrect that bargain since 2007, and it hasn't worked. And you know, now obviously this is why we're seeing the kind of reaction that we are.
Grace is right as well about how deeply embedded in our culture now is this. I always think of Uber, which I think is an extraordinary economic model, where the worker is the capitalist. He or she invests in the car, buys the car, and more expensively maintains the car, and even more expensively insures the car. And Silicon Valley attaches that worker and his asset, the car, to a bit of software, which they've, by the way, pinched from someone else, you know, GPS and all of that, which was invented by the American Navy, and a lot of it was open source software. And the owner of the asset is the capitalist, if you like, but is also the worker. And in Silicon Valley, the new capitalist simply sits there and drains every car ride of 20% of the fee. I mean, it's an extraordinary model. But the problem is people's incomes are so low that they become Uber drivers to supplement their income, but at the same time they're then sucked into this rentier economy.
Grace, the divergences between the economy engendered, this financial economy engendered by the City of London, which is largely in the southeast, and the rest of the country are pretty huge. I mean, if you look what's happened to the north, you know, people want to know why so many people voted Brexit. In my opinion, It wasn't just, in most cases, racist or that. It was a way of kicking the system that has given them nothing. It was a huge kick against neoliberal economics and this sort of flaunting of wealth when the conditions they live in are really appalling.
On the regional problem, the UK is the most regionally unequal country in Europe. Several of the poorest regions in Europe are located in the UK when adjusted for kind of purchasing power parity. And this is something that we kind of often don't talk about, particularly on the left, where we're kind of uncomfortable with this idea of thinking about a regional policy or regional economic policy. But it is so critically important, and because it's so inherently linked to sectoral inequality. Because, of course, the reason that London and the South East is so prosperous is that it depends on an industry, a set of industries, finance and related services that are highly integrated into a global economy. This kind of perpetual drive forward towards, some sort of capitalist utopia. And of course, what gets left behind is the rest of the country, which, is not wrapped up particularly strongly in the global economy, and which has been severely damaged. Manufacturing in the UK's regions, where many of our exporters used to be located. So a lot of this is not just about regional policy as such, it's about economic geography and looking at the way that capitalist globalization and financial globalization has transformed economic geography all around the world, whether that's extraction from the global south into consumer debt in the UK, or the kind of capital flight out of the poorest regions of the global economy into the wealthiest ones, creating these vast poles. And perhaps the best example of this is, say, places in the UAE, in like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, where you have entrepôts of capitalist financial accumulation surrounded by a sea of migrant labour with no rights, completely exploited, literally can't vote. Only about 20% of the population of, say, Dubai is are citizens. And that's the kind of, almost in many ways, the ideal. That is a space created entirely by capitalist financial globalization. So I think kind of coming to terms with those geographical issues, which maybe we're not that used to talking about, is also really important for understanding finance.
And it's time to wind up, but I'd ask you one last question. You've been in this game a long time, you know it well. What are the obstacles a Corbyn government would face were it to be elected? Both from within its own ranks, I hate to say this, but I'm sure there will be trouble, and from the financialized markets as a whole.
Well, I think the political right, and the political right in the Labour Party, is a very big problem. But I actually honestly believe that a Labour government would be welcomed by the city because of the threats, as I said earlier, the threats that are now facing the globalized financial system. Now, what won't be welcomed are the policies, but there is an understanding that things have gone too far, and that a Labour government, it will hopefully moderate and mediate between finance and Labour. So what's going to be really important, I honestly don't believe there's going to be a run on the pound or anything like that, because people... Because the finance sector wants a prosperous economy. To be honest, it's good for them if the economy prospers. It's not good for anyone if the economy is as weak as ours has been. So something has to be done to challenge the ideology that you have to weaken an economy but strengthen the finance sector. Personally, I think it'll depend on the mandate that Corbyn gets, and I think it'll be a popular mandate. I think there will be a lot of support for this. And I think the same will be true in the United States if a left-wing Democrats stand. And so it's going to be terribly important for any left-wing government to mobilize support and to have that political ballast before coming to power, and actually drawing on that political ballast during power.
I am perhaps less optimistic about the future relationship between the financial sector and a Labour government. I think, as Anne was saying, aspects of the financial system, so I think particularly some of the bigger banks would be, not particularly annoyed about the prospect of a Labour government, even a fairly radical Labour government. But there are certain elements of financial capital, the particularly extractive ones, the hedge funds, the shadow banking system, which would be terrified at the idea of a finance sector that's subjected to democratic control, and rightly so. So I think preparing for that potential standoff with elements of financial capital. So the tech companies, for example, as the paradigmatic examples of financialized institutions, will again, resist any attempt to move away from this extractive model based on debt, because they benefit from it so much. So again, this is why I think it's so important for the Labour Party to be based on a social movement that is both within and without it, that can kind of coalesce when the party moves into power and support it and provide that push to counter the incredible pressure that there will be on the part of the establishment. So movement building is, I think, something that is going to be incredibly important, something that we're doing quite well actually in terms of, political economy schools and bringing people together for
This is within
festivals.
Momentum? Or?
Within Momentum and within the party as well. It's a really vibrant and exciting time at the moment. So I hope we manage to continue with that.
And Pettifor, Grace Blakeley, thank you very much.